Hello there, Andy. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Sunny day in Edinburgh. It's all looking good.
Well, that's a rare beast, so I'm glad to hear it. So, thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat today. I thought that basically we can get into a little bit of how we met, but essentially, I thought you've been someone who's always been on my radar as someone who has really progressed attitudes towards sustainable design and really just going the extra mile when it hasn't necessarily been convenient or easy for you to do so. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to have you here. And again, it's not the first time in that you also did me a solid in doing a wonderful lecture series with Proto Labs back in lockdown of all times. So it's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having us back. Always a pleasure to chat and looking forward to getting into this as well because it's such a topic that's close to my heart.
So I should be mindful of the listeners that obviously I know a little bit about your background, and we have a few sort of overlaps with things like spec design. But I wonder, could you give people just a little bit of a run through of some of the companies you've been working through, and maybe just a little bit of a flourish on essentially sort of why this quite eclectic a career has maybe been quite good for you, being quite adaptive to new things like sustainability and the disruption that can bring.
Yeah, sure. I mean, really going back to the start and the thing that sparked my passion for sustainability was it was a book called Cradle to Cradle, was it, which was introduced to us like way back when. It was like 2000, 2001, when we were
Yep.
doing design engineering as a course together. And that was like the real seed that I took forward into my career and every place that I worked. So yeah, I started off at spec design and then moved over to Wide Blue, sort of like consultancy type environment, working in just like loads of different types of projects there. A little bit frustrated in that world that you don't actually see a lot of products getting into people's hands at the end of the day. So moved in-house, went to Shark Ninja, designing consumer products, like a really fast-paced, intense environment, and then moved over to Elvie, where we're really trying to develop products that like really genuinely helped people, like helping women tackle the unmet needs that they faced in everyday life. So really rewarding designing those types of products. Um, but yeah, a really interesting journey all throughout that, and seeing how the space has changed from a sort of like environmental sustainability perspective. Like when we started out, just nobody was interested. It was sort of like, mate, we're
Mm.
not being asked for this. Like nobody cares. Almost laughed at a little bit for trying to bring
Oh
some like
yeah.
principles of doing things better. And now, in my last role, like people are actively, looking for better solutions. Panicked executives at the top of companies sort of saying like, what are we going to do here? Like we've got investor reports to submit, and like what are we actually doing? And it's like, good news, we have been thinking about this. So it's been an interesting little time.
And maybe that's actually a nice point just to reference of that. I alluded to the interview, which we'll have to put in the description and comments below. But essentially the discussion we had at Proto Labs in 2020 in lockdown. How do you feel things have built up since obviously COP26, which I'm sure most people in the industry, I shouldn't quote it and say it was a bit of a talking shop, and people were quite let down with sort of seeing the people walk the talk. So would you say that in 2023 are we seeing a bit of a sort of reality check? Are we starting to get the bit between the teeth, would you say, or am I being naive here?
Um, Not being naive, wishful thinking, perhaps. It's a tough one. Like you're definitely getting questioned asked. I see a lot of sort of like panic from a sustainability perspective. Like again, company executives not really sure what to be doing. I think just in the space, people don't have that carbon literacy to actually know what we all understand. We have to do better things in life and work and in everything we do. But that sort of carbon literacy is not necessarily there to understand what we can do. There's a few people out there that understand, but just not enough actually. So yeah, how can we educate people to understand like what can we actually do to make a difference? A lot of people pulling in a lot of different directions right now.
Mm.
uh, so it's like, yeah, where do we go from there? I think a thing that frustrates me a little bit is that it's taken me, nearly 15 years to figure out like the real focus that we should all have is its emissions. And it's greenhouse gases, it's the planet's warming, and we've all sort of understood that, but we've been talking so much about like recycling, we've kind of not really had our eye in the prize as a sort of like human collective. This one, and it's like, whilst that is important, it's the fact that the temperatures are going up, and it's emissions being the big thing that we actually have to tackle and have to figure out what we're doing in business, how we design products, how we use energy. That's really the big item.
And maybe this leads us into we actually just on this morning we were both watching the Fairphone CEO Bas van Abel talk at the Design Council conference on sort of Better Planet, and indeed he made the point that at the end of the day, if you're taking something out of the earth or growing something on the earth, that is consumption. And so really he's saying, you're quite right that there are carbon offsets, there are life cycle analysis, these are legitimate, helpful tools. But he was also being slightly provocative to say it's also not that complicated. If you have a phone and you get a new one every year, that is not as good as if you get a new one every 8 years and you upgrade a few little widgets along the way. And so that sort of deconstructing of the consumer product is something where I would say we sort of picked up the conversation again recently, in that I was sort of looking quite closely at little lithium polymer batteries and the legislation that is coming around them, saying that these cannot be this glued in inaccessible things that you can't switch out and replace. So maybe to sort of riff off your earlier point of, do you feel that, as you said, the C-suite company executives feeling that the legislation is now, really coming and sort of snapping at the profits now, and so that is a incentive to task the design teams to not just squeak under the radar of these things, but actually embrace them and make a virtue of it as part of the product offering?
I mean, that's definitely the case. Yeah, there's the right to repair legislation, extended producer responsibility as well. And that is going to be challenging for, company executives and how they run their business. It's going to make products more expensive because there's more design time in figuring out how to make things truly repairable. You've obviously got to have like the spare parts in market for longer. The extender producer responsibility is really interesting as well. Again, it's just like it adds cost. So yeah, people are going to have to start rethinking their business models and how they accommodate this. And like, how do you maintain a competitive advantage over your competitors with this new system of sort of designing products and putting them out there into the field? Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how the space develops. It's going to be a massive change. When the legislation like this is introduced, there's always like unintended consequences. We don't know what those are going to be yet at this point. Some companies are going to react really well. There's going to be disruptive startups coming in to change business models and like really challenge the status quo. So legislation that's coming in, like how can we reinvent the business models to put ourselves in a place to sort of take advantage of this and start businesses that don't have the kind of legacy infrastructure that these kind of like corporate behemoths have, and they're going to struggle to really change and adapt to these new laws that are coming in. So it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, and indeed, maybe actually Fairphone is a good example in that we talked about business models here of that Fairphone, as in most people assume there is the company, but there is the product. So the actual phone, which you can take apart and replace things and is great. But then there's also a set of headphones called, confusingly, Fairphones Fairbuds XL. But basically they're sort of like a version of these sorts of things in wonderful green colors. But I think it's an important distinction to say the mobile phone business model, it being completely candid, I still feel that it is not, sort of comparable necessarily to pull me away from my current addiction to the Apple ecosystem. Because for me, if I could change the phone, I would in a heartbeat. But it's, but if I'm going to be honest, it's the security, it's all the airdrop, it's all sorts of interconnectivity between my devices. That's actually what locks me in. If hypothetically Fairphone could run iOS, I would change tomorrow, and you can hold me to that. Whereas with the headphones, really, it's an island. It doesn't have this complicated ecosystem of lock-ins. So if you ask me to say when eventually my headphones give up, which I've slightly shot myself in the foot because I just repaired them, so I'm not going to buy some Fairphone headphones now, sadly. But if I did, my next one really would be, because the sound quality is great, the noise cancelling is at least on par for the price bracket, and by the time you go through all the ethics of the product, it's a no-brainer. So I think even within a company like that, you have actually two very distinct business models. One which purely is a product for product offering, and the other one is a product, but really it's a product service. And so I'm wondering, how do you think companies will navigate that tension between wanting to innovate the materials, the production, all of that sort of stuff, but we know the secret trick is the lock-ins, it's all that other stuff.
I totally agree with your points. Like, if we had iOS and Fairphone, yeah, sign me up immediately. Like, my current iPhone's an iPhone 7, it's kind of nearing its actual end of life now, because it's getting to that stage where it's just not working. So I do need a new phone in the next couple of years. So great, that would be awesome. Like, ecosystem aside, the earbuds example is so good, right? There's this theory that like design works in sort of 10-year phases. Like a long time ago, it was designed for low cost. Then product experiences were kind of crappy. Then it was like design for user experience. Everybody was doing loads of user research to kind of find out what their competitive advantage. I've got a real hope that we're about to move into this stage now where it's designed for planet is the next phase, to be honest. And that's the competitive advantage that you can offer to people. So like, right, if I'm getting a set of headphones, wow, if I'm aware that these Fairphone like earbuds XL exist, like those are the ones I'm getting, because like I know people have been treated fairly in the production of that product. I know that the design decisions have been made, or the best design decisions possible, with the planet in mind. And then you can completely break it apart from a recycling point of view once it's like really reached the end of its life. So that's the kind of core thing. Like, I know the usability will be sorted because everybody understands how to design for people now. Like that competitive advantage is kind of gone. It's built in. It's kind of like table stakes. So now it's like, offer me that planetary option and environmental sustainability, and it's like, I'm buying that. And I think that's the way things are moving. I really hope they are.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that I thought, if I remembered correctly from some of our discussions, you've either visited or certainly spent a lot of time looking at the what happens to your devices when they get thrown into a grinder or whatever. One of the complications of gluing this in and making it not accessible with screws or such like, you said it's a pretty dangerous thing. Could you walk us through a little bit of the ramifications of, should we say, being let's call it what it is, a negligent designer with a product?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like a recycling center, an e-waste center. There's a bit of human time, like going, right, that's high value, and they'll take those aside and they'll take those apart and get the valuable bits out of them, process it. For everything else, and that's the vast majority, goes straight into a shredder. And we got a tour around the center, and the manager that was like begging us as designers to, like, if you can do one thing for us, make the batteries removable, because if we can't get those batteries out, it goes into the shredder, the battery explodes, creates fires. Like, we have to deal with a number of fires like every week. Generally that's sort of okay, but it can be pretty dangerous, and we would just not deal with that. It'll make our operations more efficient if we're not dealing with fires all the time. So just have to make the batteries removable as like a bare minimum.
Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out, to not that we would encourage anyone to induce a fire with one of these, not simply because it's like a little firework, but actually also the chemicals that given off when it burns are extremely nasty.
Mhm.
And so I think, again, it shouldn't be played down that this is just like, oh, does it matter if it bursts, just put a fire extinguisher on it, job done. It's really, this is a sort of, extreme assault on the environment that it's in.
Yeah.
So I guess sort of, one of those things that, we'd been discussing a little bit prior to this is I had been sort of bouncing around the seemingly stupid question, but the more people I ask, including yourself, it doesn't seem to be so stupid, is one of the companies, maybe I should just not to shame them, but just to give an honest example of a lithium polymer company that hopefully you can see the screen here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Basically sort of touting the fact that it sells over 5,000 different SKUs, different types of battery. And when you ultimately scroll down through all of these, you realize that when you look at this table, and I won't sort of get into the minutiae here for the viewers, but essentially the punchline for me is some of the differences are as trivial as 1 millimeter in dimension of width or length. Thickness, I can see an argument for. And sometimes a difference of 5 milliamp hours, which is basically within what I would call tolerance variation of
Yeah.
product and indeed electrical specs. So the notion that people are making decisions and have not been funneled into a degree of decision, which is, do you want AAA or do you want AA batteries in the old school system? I think it's fair enough if designers said, well, we need a bit more variety than that, Jude. We're trying to design headphones here. But I think, for example, if they locked in 3 different sizes that worked with hearing aids and headphones,
Yeah.
would that be adequate? And then essentially, if you want to deviate from that, maybe you pay a tax the same way in Scandinavia you pay a sugar tax if you want to go crazy, but it's your choice. You pay for it.
Yeah.
So what's your reaction to a standardization model for lithium batteries? Would Duracell ever become a purveyor of quality rechargeable batteries?
Yeah. I mean, I, truthfully, my answer is I don't know why it's not like that as a starting point. I
Yep.
just like that level of choice. It actually becomes more bamboozling as a designer. It's just like the amount of time you spend scrolling through that page. You're going to get RSI, and then you've got to understand the nuances of each one. And yeah, I mean, just give me like a sort of like a AAA size, triple, like it would be so much easier. And then, right, if you need to go to that bespoke level, okay, right, you pay the excess for that. But yeah, standardization really helps the designer as well. Something that was sparked at the sort of the design council series that's been going on is this idea as a designer, like, could you provide like a sort of like health check with the components that you're buying as
Mm.
well, like to go along with that, so you've got an indication of, like, okay, the supply chain has been verified as ethical, there's no conflict minerals in there, so it's sort of like when you're specifying your components, it's like, yeah, you've specified genuinely good ones, because
Yeah.
as a designer and engineer, you just don't know.
Mm.
And it would take an incomprehensible amount of time to try and go and certify those things. So
Mm.
standardization, certification on these things would be such a help when we try to develop just better products.
Yeah, I mean, I think don't get me wrong, I'm not likely to phone up Bass from Fairphone and just say, so when you're gonna sell your batteries as OEM for any designer to use, as they only have a range of about 2 or 3. But it's an interesting itch to scratch of go, wouldn't it be great if the problem went away of saying I don't have to do all of that heavy lifting. I
Yeah.
can incorporate it into my design. As you said, it comes pre-certified with appropriate recommendations for how to install it, the same way Apple allows third parties to build cables through the MFI scheme.
Yeah.
Is it implausible that we can just have design code to say this is how you install our batteries so that they work? Simple as. Oh dear. Oh, sorry, a little technical difficulty there. I need the little clapper board to start again. I was just basically asking your response to, obviously I wouldn't want to put Fairphone on the spot by saying they should become Duracell because it's obviously not their current business strategy or model, but just hypothetically as a designer, would it alleviate some of the pain of if you had a pre-certified OEM battery, which then the consumer, should they end up buying a product later in life, they can also realize there's a trusted source as well, and buy with confidence the same way I buy a Duracell battery with confidence.
Yes, 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 like 1,000 times yes. Just give me those solutions as a designer to put into the products, and I will take it. It's like such a no-brainer that just doesn't exist right now. I'm sure it's the same for everybody else that's out there as well. Um, it's an interesting point. You talk about like Fairphone. It's not fair to ask them to do that, but like they've put so much time and effort into that. You kind of look for your competitive advantages and how you can pivot. And there's 1,000+ components in a mobile phone. So
Yeah.
wow, if I could get access to that data and the suppliers for those components to put into my designs, that would be just great.
Well, I think I'm just aware that, from my many roles at places like Lego that, as they say, curb your enthusiasm. But yeah, in fairness, you're right. Bass was certainly on the soapbox this morning, and that let's just say the offer would be amazing, I think, for a lot of designers if we did have those sort of options. And actually, maybe that nicely brings us on to a little example. And I should stress this is my own little brain noodling around and not affiliated or associated with Yoto, but I absolutely love this little children's music player, which I'm sure you're familiar with as well.
Oh,
You
you've got
basically
one.
slide in these little cards, and essentially through a bit of wizardry, it ends up playing basically the MP3s through the device. And I would say that, by sheer coincidence, I was talking to a mum today at school, and she's got one, and I said, "Oh, what would you do with it when you've, finished?" And she said, "Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess, of course, I would obviously gift it to someone because it's really well designed, and it obviously doesn't need to go to landfill, basically, to paraphrase." And so, I think what's nice about the Yoto player is that, ironically, it's such a beautiful product. It's so lovingly made. The company has, extraordinary ethics in wanting to build the best possible thing they can for kids. My point is, it feels on brand to say, surely you'd want to gift this. And to my point about business model, again, this is my own hunch, this isn't verified, but I would imagine it's a bit like printers and ink. They are making a lot of money off the cards and probably a little bit of money off the actual product. And so really it feels right to say, keep the product away from landfill, as to Fairphone's point, keep upgrading it, keep putting a new battery in after 2-3 years, but keep buying basically new audiobooks. So I think the question I have for you is a little bit, what other companies do you think have that business model that seems potentially ripe for the taking, or are they few and far between?
Yeah, I think sadly, honestly, it's quite few and far between. We've had little chats in this in the past, but
Yeah.
whenever we talk about like the poster children that we look to for inspiration, it's Fairphone for phones, Framework laptop. A kind of a newer one that we've become aware of recently is like the Loop vacuum cleaner. And
Yes.
that's super interesting. So it's like really high performance. But I mean, literally, if any aspect of that thing breaks down, you can go onto their website and buy that replacement component to the extent where it's like, it actually looks like you could go and buy every component separately and like put it together like a Lego kit. It's pretty incredible. And I think it's pretty hard to fault anything that they've done there. So that's my sort of new poster child, I think. Is the Loop vacuum cleaner. But yeah, beyond that, honestly, I'm scratching my head. There's the Sooty toothbrush. But yeah, have you got any more?
No, as I said, I think it was a little bit of should we say, setting it up, but Yeah, I think that was the irony was that you and me were both scratching our heads saying this is not easy to find 10 quick poster children. And yeah, just quickly got the screen here with the loop vacuum cleaner parts. And as you said, it's literally everything from little rollers all the way down to filters, charging cords, and it keeps going on. So I think, again, the thing that's worth acknowledging is that is a lot of expense. It's a lot of inventory. And for companies like Fairphone to say that they're going to keep all that stuff going for 8 years with the Fairphone 5, that's a heck of a commitment. And I think it's reasonable to assume that whatever calculations were made today is entirely possible. Maybe they need to adjust as they go along. So I suspect the wave of consumers that buy into these more aspirational brands will probably have to ride out a few little, blips and tweaks. But I kind of think that's a little bit, you come along for the ride. And I don't know if you've read Shoe Dog by Phil Knight of Nike fame, but he was very much making the point that the true believers will tolerate a few little mistakes and glitches because they know you're striving for better. And I think increasingly it doesn't feel like this is just entirely wishful thinking and sort of virtue signaling. It's that I think for the consumer, you are being offered a way to essentially make a choice, have agency. I also have a very old phone like you of an iPhone SE, and I've replaced the battery a good couple of times now. And so it sort of feels good to sort of keep things in play. And actually, I've never really wanted one of these massive screen things because I sort of fumble them basically. So I think as well, giving consumers choice that they can dial in the different variables, I think that'll be an interesting one. So
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say there was this kind
yeah,
of discussion about, like Fairphone as a subscription. Like so much
yeah,
software is like you just pay by subscription, so that model's normal. And it's just like, yeah, maybe if you pay like 10 quid a month or something like that, and that's like your mobile phone hardware provider,
yeah.
and bits will break down, bits will be upgraded, and your phone carries on with you, but like the phone actually is constantly changing and evolving, and provided that the components which are being removed are being handled in a responsible way, it's like people need technology in their life, so you can't think of a much more responsible way to manage it than that.
Mm, mm. But yeah, I think this is sort of, as I said, it is hard to sort of cite that many different companies, but I think maybe a sort of more prosaic thing would be to say what would you say are some of your tips and tricks for designers thinking, okay, well, like I can't necessarily change the world immediately. We're not Fairphone, but we've mentioned, not gluing batteries in, not making them so you can't get them out at end of life, trying to make them so that they could be repairable as per legislation which is coming. Is there any other considerations you think would sort of help transition companies to a greener imperative?
Oh yeah, so you started off there with like tips for designers, engineers, and how can companies have sort of a greener direction, I guess, paraphrasing.
Yeah,
One thing that I've learned a bit painfully over the years is that trying to push a sustainability agenda in a company is that analogy of like rolling a boulder up the hill. So have a good think about whether your company is actually it's capable of change.
yeah.
Like and really get a sense for if there's a passion to do it. And if there's not, like question whether you should be at that company, honestly. Maybe have a look around and see if you can find companies that have got environmental sustainability as like one of their core pillars and something they're really trying to go for. Because if you're passionate about doing it, you'll be able to really apply that upskill there much, much easier than a company that's resisting.
Mm-hmm.
So just sanity check what you're doing. If you can't find companies that interest you, I would seriously encourage people to consider setting up their own. Like if you're not seeing that opportunity for change and you think it's going to be too slow and we need really urgent change, like take that energy and start a company and something that you believe in. So that's before getting into like the nuts and bolts. Be ambitious as well. Like there's a bit of language coming out now through our politicians sort of saying, oh, yes, we're going to be pragmatic about climate change and stuff like that. It's a climate emergency. So emergencies need pretty radical action. So don't limit your ambition, be a bit activist, really push. Like change requires like a bit of pain, a bit of discomfort. You're going to get resistance. If you're not getting resistance, you're probably not pushing hard enough as well. Then I suppose think about being influential. Don't be a thorn in people's side. Like present environmentally sustainable options like with positivity, talk about how it can improve your company's competitive advantage. It's like, it's a disaster if you're introducing things that are going to be a cost and are going to take more time. Yeah. How does it benefit your company going forward? So those are just like 3 pragmatic things going in. And then there's a ton of good resources out there, you know, like Ellen MacArthur Foundation and how to design products more sustainably and things like that. Like those bits of information aren't hard to find. And a lot of it's just like really simple stuff. Like most things get shredded, make the battery removable.
Yeah.
Try to go for simple materials, not complex blends of plastics and things like this. Mm-hmm. Like inherently make the product repairable. Just don't wait on the legislation and stuff. Like, you know how to assemble a product. That means you know how to take it apart again. Just don't make it hard to take it apart. Like just that's just a good thing to do. So that's quite a simple one, really.
Yeah, no, and certainly, you know, that there are many pros and cons to working at Dyson, but I think one of the things that almost sort of, I think, happened by accident, you could say, was that because the design methodology was always take things apart, test it, put it back together, test it all the time. Yeah. Actually, weirdly, their design language and ethos became highly repairable. So actually, I think it wasn't a sort of huge undertaking. Not that it isn't huge credit to the people who spearheaded that, but I think sometimes there's a real pleasure in having nice design that isn't just glued and ultrasonically welded shut. I think, of course, there are necessities to this, and maybe one of the things I think is maybe a moot point. It's not quite as hard and fast as make batteries extractable, but I think when I was discussing, I was saying I think that we're in for a fashion maybe of embracing the chunkiness, as I put it. Yeah. In that I actually don't think Fairphone's headphones are actually any chunkier, but it might be that say if you made some tiny in-ear ones, they do just need to be a bit bigger because you need a hatch or a thing to basically take it apart. Yeah. I think sometimes a counterpoint that we discussed a little bit, just to add it as a provocation, is that often we don't always see how fast things are going to accelerate with the right business incentive. And of course, things like, you know, war and medicine pull the technology along. But I think even just consumer enthusiasm for things, I think if you had said to someone 100 years ago, could you imagine a watch that was waterproof to 100 meters? It would just seem ludicrous. Yet for some reason that became a desirable necessity. Whether it is a necessity, I think, is actually a debatable point.
It's totally absurd. Like, who's going to 100 meters underwater? Like, your head would implode.
but I think that's almost the point, is that when people say, oh, but you couldn't possibly make a replaceable battery for that's user serviceable, Timex does that. You get a coin, you twist the back off, it pops out, you put it back in, it's still waterproof and this isn't a Rolex, this is $100 watch. Yeah. So the notion that the smartest people in Apple, Samsung, Nokia couldn't figure this out with enough R&D budget, I would like to think that they could. You know.
Yeah. And the challenge is down, I think, now to Apple as well. Like they'll have seen a really interesting response to, you know, the big advert that they did recently about Mother Earth being on side. And it's like, I think a lot of people, even if you're not involved in this space, are sort of like, that smells a bit iffy, that one. So the challenge is now down to them to see, like, how do you actually react to that and genuinely do better? So like, you really are putting your money where your mouth is, because I think consensus is actually that was a bit greenwashy.
Yeah. And I think it's, you know, again, I know that I wrote my piece on LinkedIn about it being critical, but I think I was also trying to be aspirational to sort of essentially say you're better than this, because they really do have some of the best talent in the world. And for me, I thought really the provocation I was trying to make by bringing in George Carlin's punchline, which I'm not sure whether I should swear, but he said, the planet's fine, it's the people who are in trouble, shall we say, beginning with an F. And basically, I think for me, the interesting thing is we need to shift the narrative from this ridiculous assumption that we are somehow in the guardians of the earth and that we shall give our benevolence and look after it and save the planet. George Carlin's point is the planet's been through ice ages, meteor strikes, the whole lot, you name it. Extinction just happens. His point is we actually need to take it seriously or we will die. And I think even if you think, don't worry about it, I'm probably going to make it to the grave, just having the compassion that, well, your children aren't. It's not going to be fun for them.
Totally, yeah. I've heard another good analogy as well. Like, I do think we need a bit of language change about like saving the planet. It's kind of saving ourselves, but that sounds a bit narcissistic. There's another one is sort of like, it's like protecting the economy as well, because if we don't have an economy, civilization kind of collapses. But yeah, if we've got raging wildfires and mass migration of people, like the economy is really going to struggle, and that we're going to struggle to like maintain our livelihood. So there's maybe something there as well about just really getting that language on point to get everybody on board here and start demanding change from the product, services, energy use they have in their life, etc.
Yeah. And look, and Andy, I think this has been such a pleasure talking. And I think, certainly for me, dare I say it, if there is designers watching this, I think the honest truth is, as someone who's been working in these sorts of spaces as you have for all these years, I got to be honest and have full disclosure. This is the most fun area to work as well. It is where the hardest challenges are. It's where the most brilliant people are gravitating towards. If you want to transform your career, being entirely self-serving, I think this is the one to bet the chips on. I think this is where the cool project, where you get to tell your grandkids, I put something into that for the right reasons, and it was, sure, you might look back on it and see all sorts of problems with it, but I think it's the same with the Fairphone. Fairphone 1, Bass was pretty quick to say it had a load of problems with it, but look at where they are now, and I think that's the attitude is, we are not going to fix all of these sustainability problems with one magic wave of a wand. It's an iterative grind. And I think it's about how that we sort of like build some tenacity and determination around that. So yeah, thank you, Andy. I think you embody so much of this, and I encourage people to check out your folio and all the work that you've been doing, as it's really an inspiration. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jude. Pleasure talking to you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.